Marcus hadn't slept. Not really. He had laid down for a few hours somewhere around midnight, but his mind had never actually stopped moving, turning the problem over and over the way you turn something in your hands looking for a place to grip it. By 3 a.m. he was back at his desk in the empty office, the building quiet around him, the city outside his window glowing soft and steady, and completely unaware of what was sitting 7 stories beneath its streets. The problem was not complicated to understand. It was just nearly impossible to solve. You could not shut the water off. That was the beginning and the end of it. 4 million people, 2 major hospitals, hundreds of buildings that needed water not tomorrow, not in an hour, but right now and continuously. The moment you cut pressure to that corridor, you weren't just inconveniencing people. You were making hospitals choose between procedures. You were leaving residential towers without sanitation. You were creating the exact crisis you were trying to prevent, just through a different door. So the water had to keep moving while you replaced the pipes it was moving through. Marcus stared at that sentence on his screen for a long time. The idea he had was not new in concept. Engineers called it live switching, the practice of rerouting flow through alternate paths while you worked on the primary line, the way a surgeon reroutes blood through an external bypass while operating on the heart. It had been done before on smaller scales, on isolated pipe sections, on systems with enough redundancy built in to absorb the rerouting without stress. The mid-layer corridor had redundancy. Not a lot of it, but enough, parallel lines running adjacent to the primary trunks, secondary connection paths that could theoretically carry redistributed flow if the load was managed carefully enough. The word carefully was doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence, because here was the reality of what live switching across a 40-kilometer corridor actually meant. You were not rerouting one pipe. You were rerouting a system. Every time you shifted pressure away from one section to work on it, that pressure had to go somewhere else. And that somewhere else was a network of pipes that were already working at capacity. Push too much flow into an alternate path and you overpressurized it. Overpressurize an aging pipe and you accelerated the exact kind of stress fracturing you were trying to fix. The whole thing was a calculation that had to be right, not approximately, not mostly, but exactly, and it had to stay right continuously, in real time, across 40 kilometers, while the city above went about its day completely normally. Marcus built the operational model through the rest of the night. By the time the sun came up and the building started filling with people again, he had something that looked like a plan. Not a comfortable plan. Not a plan with wide margins and easy fallbacks. A plan that required the pressure sequencing to be executed in precise order, each section handed off to the next within tight tolerances, the whole corridor managed like an instrument being played carefully enough that the audience never heard a wrong note. He sent it to Thomas Hale at 7 a.m. with a single line beneath it. Tell me where I'm wrong. Thomas called him 20 minutes later and they spent 2 hours on the phone going through it together, Thomas pushing on every assumption, every load calculation, every handoff point, and Marcus defending the ones that held and adjusting the ones that didn't. It was the best kind of argument, the kind between 2 people who wanted the same thing and were willing to be wrong in service of getting there. By mid-morning they had a version of the plan that both of them believed in. Not loved. Believed in. There was a difference. The council approved it that afternoon without much deliberation. They were past the point of deliberating. The inspection report had removed all the comfortable distance between the problem and the decision. Rourke signed the emergency authorization and told Marcus he had full resource access, equipment, personnel, whatever the operation required. Marcus thanked him and went straight to work. They began 4 days later. The first section was the northernmost end of the corridor, one of the 14 critical points Thomas's team had flagged, but not the worst of them. A deliberate choice. You started where you had the most margin for error, learned what the system actually did under live switching conditions versus what the model predicted it would do, and you carried those lessons forward into the harder sections. That was the plan. The pressure rerouting began at 4 a.m. when citywide demand was at its lowest point. Marcus watched the numbers from the operations center, a room that looked, in that moment, like every screen in the building had been pulled into one place. Venn was running continuous monitoring across the entire corridor, feeding real-time pressure readings to the team every few seconds. Underground, Thomas's crew was working on the first section, cutting out the damaged pipe segment, fitting the replacement, the work itself straightforward enough once you had the pressure safely rerouted away from it. For the first 2 hours everything moved exactly the way the model said it would. Marcus let himself breathe a little. At 6:23 a.m. the city started waking up. It happened the same way it happened every morning, gradually and then all at once. Showers running, buildings drawing on the system, the demand curve rising steadily as the hours moved. Marcus watched it climb on his screen and watched the pressure readings and the alternate routing paths climb with it and kept his eyes on the tolerances, the numbers that told him how much room he had before the rerouted load became a problem. The tolerances held. Tighter than he wanted, but they held. By 9 a.m. the first section was done. New pipe in the ground, joint sealed, pressure restored. Thomas's team moved to the second point. Marcus looked at the corridor map on his screen. 40 kilometers. 14 critical points. 7 dangerous joints. They had completed one. They were 11 days into the operation when it happened. Not at a critical point. Not at one of the 7 joints they had been treating like unexploded ordnance. It happened at Section 9, a transfer point between the primary rerouting path and a secondary line, a location that the model had rated as moderate risk, well within tolerances, not a place anyone had been losing sleep over. The pressure sequencing for Section 9 required a precise handoff. Flow shifted from the primary alternate path to the secondary line for a window of about 40 minutes while the crew worked on the main trunk below. The handoff had worked cleanly on every previous section. Marcus authorized it at 7:15 in the morning and turned his attention to the crew radio. At 7:31 a.m. a fracture in the secondary line, undetected, too small for the standard acoustic scans to have flagged, sitting in a section of pipe that predated even the corridor's installation, gave way under the redistributed pressure load. Not a slow failure. Not a warning. The pipe split along 8 feet of its length and 20,000 liters of water per minute found a way out. The street above caved in 40 seconds later. It was a side street in the mid-district, not a main road, and it was early enough that the worst outcomes didn't happen. No vehicles went in. Nobody was standing on that particular square of pavement at that particular moment. The sinkhole opened fast and deep, and the sound of it brought people out of the surrounding buildings into the street where they stood looking at the hole in the ground and the water rising in it and the alarm lights already moving toward them from 2 directions. Marcus heard it through his earpiece before he saw it on the screen. He stood very still for 3 seconds. Then he started working. The rupture was contained within the hour. Emergency isolation valves, the system's built-in circuit breakers, shut off flow to the failed section automatically. Thomas's underground crew rerouted manually. The sinkhole was cordoned off. The water was pumped out. By mid-morning the street above looked like a construction site rather than a disaster, which was the best possible version of what it was. But the city had seen it. People had photographed it. By noon it was everywhere, the hole in the ground, the water, the emergency crews. And with it came the questions that Rourke had been dreading since the beginning. What happened? Why? How bad is it? Is my water safe? Marcus sat in the operations center that afternoon and looked at the corridor map. They had completed 9 of the 14 critical sections. 5 remained. Including the 7 joints, 3 of which sat in the final stretch of the corridor. The stretch that ran beneath the oldest part of the city. The rupture had cost them a day. It had also cost them something harder to recover, the quiet. The operation that had been moving invisibly beneath the city was invisible no longer. And the section they still had ahead of them was the one that had kept Marcus awake before any of this started.